Okay, we are going to start now. I'm Mujahid Bilici. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at John Jay College at City University of New York. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today at Zahra Institute. I'm also Director of Academic Affairs at Zahra Institute, the organization hosting this talk. Aslam Kakar is a PhD candidate in global affairs at Rutgers University, and his dissertation compares the social movements of Kurds in Turkey and the Pashtuns in Pakistan. Kakar is the founder of Pashtun Studies Network and an alumni of Zahra Institute. I got the Kurdish Studies certificate, online certificate. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this exciting conversation. The topic for today is, what do the Kurds in Turkey want now? Now doesn't have much to do with the elections. It has rather to do with the reality on the ground. So this talk is based on some research in the field. Aslam is going to tell us more about that. So we are curious to hear the latest from the field. Aslam, please.
Thank you so much, Mujahid, my friend, Professor Mujahid taught me, and Zahra Institute for this kind invitation. I am very honored and humbled. Also, thanks to the Kurdish Studies certificate, which really helped me get deeper in my conversations in the field with people in Istanbul and in the Southeast, in the Kurdish region, and to Mamasta Ibrahim, Mamasta Bahadin, Mamasta Mustafa for connecting me with people on the ground, without which I wouldn't have been able to talk to people. Also to, I know they're not here, but Professor Murad Somar at Koç University and Professor Buland Kuchek at Boğaziçi University for hosting me as a guest researcher, which really, again, helped me connect with people. And most importantly, to the people of Kurdistan in the Southeast, who spoke to me in the most frank ways possible. So let me start. As you can see, this is part of, I went to Turkey to conduct research for my PhD, which you mentioned, compares the social movements of Kurds in Turkey and Pashtuns in Pakistan. And this study, or this essay article, it came out of that field work. And this was an observation that while doing interviews, I had. And then the question was like, what do the Kurds want now? So let me start. So I conducted this research as part of my PhD dissertation from October 2021 to February 2022 in Istanbul and Southeast Turkey, in the provinces of Batman, Mardin, and Diyarbakir, or Ahmad, as the Kurds honored. After dozens of interviews and conversations with people in the Southeast, two things struck me. First, the Kurds have experienced far more oppression and repression than I had realized from my extensive history and literature reviews, probably because of my proximity to the conflict and to the land of the conflict. Second, the narrative around what the Kurds want now is more complex, or so I find, than scholars have so far presented, especially when accounting for views in the private sphere where an individual enjoys a certain degree of autonomy unhampered by state interventions. The state intervention in the public sphere has been deep and thorough, as we all know. Sanam Aslan, in her book on nation building on the Kurds and Berbers, is correct in calling this an extreme makeover of the Kurdish society by the Turkish state. Until recently, the Turkish state has denied the Kurds their ethnic identity and continues to punish them for demanding equality and justice. Most Kurdish political parties and organizations since the 1990s have been banned. Linked to political repression is cultural repression or oppression. Kurdish is not allowed to be spoken in schools and universities. The Kurds acknowledge some things have changed thanks to the Kurdish Workers' Party and HDP, but not nearly enough, though most Kurds seem to support demands of identity recognition, education in Kurdish, and self-rule. There also existed the societal undercurrent of anger, discontent, and ultimate desire of a free state in a possible world. A world in which expressing a desire for independence was not criminal, in which a referendum was feasible, and a world in which the word Kurdistan could be said without fear of retaliation by the authorities, or so I was told. The aim of an independent state, I find, is missing from the official position of Kurdish political parties and society in general in the public sphere, but the narrative in the private sphere, which is one of the contributions, I would say, or the key point of this essay, is this two-tiered analysis, the private versus the public. But the narrative in the private sphere contradicts this view. In this study, I zone in on narratives in private spaces where the Kurds showed a certain degree of candor, unable to be expressed in public because of associated risks. In a departure from top-down state and party-centric macro-political analyses, I adopt a bottom-up, people-centered micro-narratives and perspectives that privilege ordinary Kurds' daily experiences and struggles for justice and equality. And I must state that this approach is partly inspired by the perspective that Aicha Alamadoglu in this book, the very recent Kurds in the Dark Times, that they talk about, adopt in the edited book, Kurds in the Dark Times, New Perspectives on Violence and Resistance in Turkey. My study has several limitations. It is based on two regions, Istanbul in Western Turkey, and three provinces, as I mentioned, Mardin, Diyarbakir, and Batman in the southeast. Second, my sample is limited compared to quantitative studies, which I will talk in a moment. Third, I do not account for the role of factors such as political party association, religious ideology, and life philosophy such as conservatism and secularism in people's political position in the two regions. But however, the strength of my study is that it is based on in-depth interviews rooted in ethnographic and anthropological approaches. It is also important to state here that the concern in the essay is not with the feasibility or likelihood of the Kurdish statehood. Rather, it is focused on whether the Kurds have let go of the desire for an independent state, as the literature assumes. So the question, as you can see on the slide, is what do the Kurds want now? So I'll now give a brief historical overview of the Kurdish struggle in Turkey. The Kurdish demands in Turkey have changed from time to time in the past century, as Kurdish nationalism has been through several stages. Karakoj and Ozan, forgive me if I am mispronouncing the names. Karakoj and Ozan argue that even though there are different phases of the Kurdish conflict, the state's responses to the Kurdish problem between 1923 and the early 1990s can be identified as the denial of the Kurds and Kurdish problem. So that is almost 80 years. In early years of the Kurdish Republic, the Kurds fought for the reinstatement of the old Ottoman imperial social order in which the Kurds and Turks, as members of the dominant Muslim community, were treated as equals. Most Kurdish rebellions until the late 1930s focused on a mix of Kurdish Islamic rights and identity. The era from 1940s to 1950s was relatively passive. The 1960s relative liberalization gave rise to the Turkish left, which the Kurds became part of, and which also influenced the Marxist-Leninist ideology of PKK leaders and founders such as Öcalan. And of course, the Kurds had their own initiatives too. It was not that they were only started by the Turks. In summer 1967, 19 Kurdish cities were rocked by student demonstration, including 10,000 marchers in Silvan and 25,000 in the Diyarbakir. For details, again, I would encourage you to read the article by Karakoj and Uzun on this leftist socialist movements mobilization, page 27 to 29. Frequent military interventions and the social divide between the Kurds and the Turks gave major setbacks to such alliances. In 1978, as those who don't know, the PKK, Kurdish Workers' Party, was founded in the Diyarbakir in 1984. The armed conflict with the state began. The dramatic shift in the Kurdish politics under the PKK was the demand for an independent state for the Kurds. Karakoj, and I will quote, and Ozan, they write that as most of the Kurdish political movements came to existence throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the PKK built its resistance on anti-colonialism, and the ultimate objective of the movement was to form a single united independent state called Kurdistan. In 1999, after Abdullah Öcalan's arrest in Nairobi, Kenya, and his revocation of armed resistance, and the Kurdish demand supposedly changed from total independence to autonomy within a democratic Turkey. Michael Günther writes that even before Öcalan's capture, however, the PKK had abandoned its demands for Kurdish independence in favor of first federation and now simply genuine democracy within the pre-existing Turkish borders. Öcalan's decision disappointed some in the PKK leadership ranks, who split from the organization and continued fighting. Despite divisions, Öcalan still holds an influential position in the Kurdish struggle. Although he has been in prison for about 24 years or 23 years, he continues to guide Kurdish politics in Turkey and beyond. For many, he is both a political and spiritual guide, and this is based on the conversations I had with people. The Kurds would not exist had it not been for Öcalan and the PKK. I have been saying during interviews and informal conversations. However, he has opponents as well, both in the Kurdish political leadership and in public. Some argue he is not mentally fit to determine the direction of the movement from the prison cell. It is time, they contend, the Kurds moved on without his omnipresent guidance, which they argued is also not good for him. So we can do without him. This group of people were also angry with his reversal of the Kurdish demand for independence to a democratic transition in Turkey and his extreme political philosophy of a stateless world. And some even were angry that he shouldn't be satiating his desire for intellectual on the cost of the Kurdish struggle and the Kurdish rights. Others accuse him of being the ally and stooge of the state. Ibrahim Güçlü of Ala Rezgari tops the list of, I spoke to him for 6 hours, the list of such opponents. For him, Öcalan was the creation of the Turkish state to crush the Kurdish peoplehood. There are others such as Salim Churukaya, who has criticized PKK and Öcalan in his books. Now, that is a brief historical overview of Kurdish nationalism. Now, why this question now? As I said, I had this observation, and then this question came out of the observation as to what the Kurds want. And that was because because with exceptions, I could be wrong, but I'm a human being, and I've I've read literature and history and on the Kurdish struggle, and but what I find is that with exceptions, to my knowledge, most literature on the Kurdish conflict in the past 20 years seem to peddle this democratic transition view and ignores the important undercurrents of the Kurdish desire in the private sphere for a free state. And if you were to take one line from this presentation, it is, I think, this. What I do is that, contrary to the prevalent dominant view centered around rights and autonomy within Turkey, I argue in this essay that despite violent state repression dissuading the Kurds from publicly expressing their demand for independence, the narratives in the private sphere continue to radiate a defiant glow of resistance for a free state. And I'm going to reread this. Contrary to the prevalent dominant view centered around rights and autonomy within Turkey, I argue in this essay that despite violent state repression dissuading the Kurds from publicly expressing their demand for independence, the narratives in the private sphere continue to radiate a defiant glow of resistance for a free state. Now, to be sure, as I mentioned, there are studies, quantitative studies, at least 4 studies that I have come across, and to my knowledge, that focus on the Kurdish demands in the past 10 years that tackle this question of what the Kurds want. Using original data, and you can see on the slide these 4 studies, from 2 public opinion surveys conducted in 2011 and 2013 with nationwide representative sample. Sareel and Karakoch's findings show that factors such as discrimination, region, which is the Southeast, ideological factors, religion, and religious sect affect support for secession amongst Kurds. Similarly, using a survey conducted from August 2014 to October 2014 in 12 provinces in Turkey's east, Yain and his colleagues show that ethnicity is an important factor in shaping Kurds' electoral choices, and that the demands for education in Kurdish language and self-rule are backed not only by the vast majority of those Kurds who support the pro-Kurdish party, but also by a significant number of those Kurds who support the AK party, which is Öcalan's party, Erdogan's party. The results show that, as expected, and I quote, as expected, the majority of those who support the option of an independent Kurdistan are Kurdish voters. 61.6% of Kurdish voters entirely or partially support the option of independent Kurdistan, they write. In yet another study, Karakoch and Sareel argue, it seems like Karakoch and Sareel, they've done a lot of work on this particular question, because 4 of them in the 3 studies, Karakoch and Sareel, they are part of it, argue that the perception of discrimination and grievance offsets the role of religiosity on ethnicity and political choices amongst the Kurds. Religious Kurds support the PKK because they perceive the government to be discriminatory towards Kurds. Grievance and discrimination do play a role. Religiosity, they say, does not restrain support for a rebel organization, as most studies focusing on relationship between religious and ethnic fractionalization and civil war suggest. Lastly, Karakoch and Ozan, the study that I mentioned at the beginning, they claim that the findings of the public opinion survey conducted in 2015 suggests that more than 80% of the Kurdish public has demanded the right to study their language, receive an education in their mother language, get served in public institutions in Kurdish, and want to listen to Friday sermons in Kurdish. They argue that the Turkish state policy of too little, too late toward the Kurdish conflict created not only distrust, but between the two parties, but also developed cultural nationalism that is necessary for making political claims. Presently, they argue half of the Kurds are advocating for the official state recognition of their language, besides their aspiration to have their regional government, parliament, and flag within the existing state borders. The study notes that while most Kurds back the autonomy of these regional institutions, only a little more than 1/3 of the Kurds seek secession. Most importantly, they contend that if this maltreatment of the Kurds and the continuation of denial of their cultural and linguistic rights does not stop, this may help the upward trend in demanding an independent state, fostering inter-ethnic communal violence and social unrest. And one last paragraph, and then I'll move on to the next slide. Moreover, several developments in political arena between 2011 and 2015, such as the Roboski massacre on December 28, 2011, the siege of Kobani in October 2011, and the AKP's indifference to these events further confounded the already fraught relation between the state and the Kurds. And Karakoc and Ozan, they argue that these developments encouraged support among Kurds for cultural and political autonomy and secession and helped improve the image of Kurdish parties as the actual representatives of the Kurds. Now, where does my study or my essay, how does it relate to these studies? So I believe that other than these four studies, most literature on the Kurdish conflict contends that the Kurds have moved on from independence to their maximalist goal to democratic rights and autonomy within Turkey. While it is true that the official position of Kurdish political organizations and parties has shifted from independence to autonomy and rights within a democratic Turkey, there is more that is missing from the narrative. To be sure, the studies discussed earlier, as I just did, provide critical insights on the status of Kurdish demands and in getting a sense of the field in Turkey in the past decade, but my essay provides an in-depth comparative look into the most contemporary perceptions of Kurds in Istanbul and in the Southeast. In this sense, it complements the findings of these studies rather than disputes them. After living in both the Southeast and in Istanbul, contrasting narratives began to emerge. Kurds in the Southeast, having been born and raised there, have borne the brunt of state repression. They are angry, frustrated, and hopeless, but also show a deep sense of Kurdish pride. They are aware of and averse to the state assimilation policy and its overbearing presence. They've been on the forefront or on the front lines of conflict and are reminded daily of the sacrifices made to secure their Kurdish identity. Or these are my impressions from the conversations. They encounter the unabashed show of Turkish state nationalism in the form of flags, flying jets in cities like Diyarbakir, which many felt was an open-air prison. Istanbul's narratives were more complex. My impression was that most Kurds who were born and raised in Istanbul following their parents' migration or displacement seemed to have either fully but reluctantly aligned with the Turkish state's project of inclusive exclusion, or they were apathetic to the Kurdish struggle or found a way to acknowledge their Kurdish roots while navigating integration with the Turkish state. Most people of Kurdish origin I spoke to in Istanbul seemed trapped in the double burden of proving to belong to home or origins in the Southeast and to life in the metropolis, where conformity to the state narrative in everyday existence seemed inevitable for survival and socioeconomic mobility, upward socioeconomic mobility. And I find that in the Southeast, although of course the state was overtly present, but the kind of, I think, societal pressure was not felt by the people. You could easily have a conversation in Kurdish, and that I think people, Kurds living in Istanbul, were more conscious of in their daily lives. In a beautiful traditional, and these are some conversations that I had with people, in a beautiful traditional carpet shop on a street near Hagia Sophia Museum and the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, I greeted a man named, this is given by me, Javan. He was 30 and a doctor by profession. To my question about his identity, he said his parents came to Istanbul 40 years ago from Malatya, and he was born here in the city. He did not speak Kurdish fluently and considered himself half Kurd and half Turk. He did not have a strong attachment to his Kurdish identity. For him, the problem in Turkey was not ethnic, but political. People take sides on the basis of political ideology, such as secularism and conservatism, Javan said. The political elite, he believed, used the Kurdish issue to gain more votes from the Kurds. He was not particularly aware of the history of the Kurdish problem or the Kurdish struggle, and believed the Kurdish issue matters in the days ahead of elections only. When asked why some Kurds fight the state if there is no problem, he reluctantly acknowledged that some problems do exist, but he takes a neutral position on the conflict. In Qasim Pasha neighborhood, an Erdogan political stronghold in Istanbul, my roommate's 29-year-old friend and a Cop of Kurdish origin was a staunch Turkish nationalist. He had extreme hatred towards Kurdish nationalism and the PKK, which he considered a terrorist organization. He believed the Kurds didn't face any problems in Turkey. Yok, no or none, he said. It was a bit surprising and interesting to see this level of assimilation. But then, should one be surprised? Most, if not all, government servants, especially in security institutions, have a skewed orientation about these issues. This is complicated by their dependence on the state for survival. And even if he did believe the Kurds had a legitimate struggle, saying anything in its support and against the government was understandably too risky, as it could cost him his job and possible arrest. I met more Kurds in Istanbul, either native to the city or migrants from the Southeast, to verify the validity of the narratives presented in their land of origin. One such interviewee or a conversation that I had was with a 28-year-old Kurdish man. He owned a clothing store in Istanbul's Beyoğlu district and had come here 10 years ago from Diyarbakir. I came to know he was a Kurd when he asked me if I could speak Kurdish. Then I spoke to him in the little Kurdish that I know. I asked if he had faced any problems here after migration. No, he replied. Then I asked what would happen if a Turk were to come in and hear him talking to me in Kurdish. He said, nothing. I can speak my language now. It was a problem 15 to 20 years ago, but not now. He said he speaks Kurdish with his friends and doesn't hide his identity as a Kurd from the Turkish people. Then I asked if he plays Kurdish music in the shop. Soon, as I was window shopping, the voice of the legendary Kurdish singer Javan Ajo rose in silence from speakers hidden somewhere behind the clothing racks. I recognized the song Valate Man, My Homeland, right away, as if to confirm the language of his homeland still lived amongst them. Now, I think the narrative is even much more complicated, multi-layered, as it cannot be divided into these two. The Southeast people, they want Kurdistan, and in Istanbul, they don't. So here I'm trying to convey that complexity in this slide. I hope the slide, I was not really happy with the slide, but I hopefully the reading will make sense. Other Kurds appeared to have embraced the public stance of democratic rights and autonomy in Turkey, I found that pockets of Istanbul did allow for cultural expression and the space to acknowledge their Kurdish roots while navigating integration with the Turkish state. There are about 4 to 5 million Kurds, 1/3 of the city's total population in Istanbul, who have over the years been displaced from the Kurdish region in the southeast. Their presence is noticeable, particularly as artists, singers, owners of grocery stores, vintage shops, restaurants, and tea shops, amongst other businesses. Many interactions in these places made it evident that the Kurdish identity, if not as strong as in the southeast, has a strong presence in Istanbul. They showed a sense of pride in being Kurds, but there was also caution in their interaction. A young Kurdish man in his late 20s in a Kurdish cafe questioned who I worked for when I told him I am a researcher on Kurdish society and politics. Istikhbarat, as we say, and he said istikhbarat, intelligence. He wondered if I worked for an intelligence agency. The wariness continued in a mall in Diyarbakir, where one Kurdish woman who had lost 5 family members to the armed conflict questioned my intentions and inquired why she should trust me with sensitive information, which of course was completely understandable. During my time in Istanbul, I attended several Kurdish music concerts, cultural events, and social gatherings. Some concerts were attended by hundreds or more Kurds. It became evident from these events that they had the freedom to express and celebrate their identity through music, art, and literature. But it was unclear where the line of cultural expression and assimilation was drawn. That, I think, was a point that was, I was constantly thinking about. Like, if you do not have the rights, how can you do all of this? And then the line, where is the line drawn? Is the state aware of this? Is the state not aware of it? Is this a big deal or is this not a big deal? So I think this is yet to be, I guess, investigated further. But these communities offering freedom of expression were rare, despite the state claiming otherwise. Despite geographical location, I found that many Kurds do support the Kurdish struggle, but not all were hopeful for a positive change. Some don't want to be in trouble. Some were disappointed and just wanted to live their lives. For a century, the Kurds, as I showed in the historical overview, the Kurds have been in conflict with the Turkish state. Several generations have seen violence and death in Diyarbakir, and this kind of view also was there, but I think it was, I would say, a minority. In Diyarbakir, a high school teacher, Azad, in his late 20s said, I don't care about feeling Kurdish or Turkish. I want to be a human being. I'm just me, a human being. I don't care about ethnicity as an important dimension of my identity. So he thought he cannot have rights, and he was more interested in economic rights and like living a peaceful life than, identifying himself as Kurd. Many people were also fatigued and frustrated. They felt the Turkish-Kurdish conflict had destroyed their lives, perhaps one more reason to acquiesce to assimilation. So in conclusion, hope I'm not going to repeat myself, I think there were at least 2 positions on what the Kurds want today. One, democratic transition, represented mostly by the party heads and representatives and people in general in public sphere, and the other, the desire of an independent state expressed by most people I met in the private sphere. The desire for an independent state being particularly strong in the southeast. Abdullah Zaitoun, the head of IHD, a human rights organization in Diyarbakir, he said, yes, there are Kurds who would like an independent state. But expressing that desire is dangerous. It is a crime. You will go to prison. That is why it is hard to measure. 2 people were arrested for saying that. So an atmosphere of fear in public contrasted pride and free socio-political and cultural imaginaries of people in the private. The state had crushed their bodies and destroyed their homes. but was unable to win over their resolve. Former HDP member of parliament, Zahra, forgot her last name, which is shameful. She said,
Akçınar, yeah, Zahra Akçınar.
Yeah. She said, most of the Kurds want an independent state, but I cannot say all want it. Some Kurds would like to be integrated under the condition that their identity and rights are protected. Similar views were reflected by many other people that I spoke to. So, okay, but in that's the conclusion. But I think there are also questions that I want to just spend a minute on. I think the questions that need to be, I think, addressed or investigated further in the future. One is that whether the narrative in the private sphere will take a political shape in the future as Turkey's continued denial of official Kurdish recognition will more likely lead to further political instability. So I don't address in the essay. What will the Kurds make of this defined glow in the private sphere? Second, and relatedly, a blatant state oppression blatant state oppression continues unabated, will more Kurds support the legal politics of parties such as HDP, or will they divert their support to extra legal politics of parties like the PKK? Third, not fourth, this was also, as you can see, why would more settled and prosperous ethnic Kurds move from the west to the east? So that question also comes up in Michael Gunther's article. He says the fact that as many as 60% of Turkey's Kurds now live west of Ankara, that is outside of their historic homeland in the southeast of Turkey, makes Kurdish independence from Turkey even more impractical. Why would these ethnic Kurds, many of whom are at least partially assimilated anyway, want to give up their more prosperous lives in the west to return to a problematic future in the east? This is, I think, an important question, which I thought about when I visited the predominantly Kurdish populated neighborhoods in Istanbul. I think future studies need to address these and other questions. And thank you so much for listening, for your patience, and any comments, questions are welcome.
Thank you, Aslam. That was a fascinating presentation. A lot of nuances captured in your investigation, and your three concluding questions are certainly they invite a lot of discussion. But I want to say, make few remarks about your kind of broader arguments. Your kind of comparison of Istanbul versus Southeast, the Kurdish lands, is very interesting because it shows a kind of bifurcation of discourse among the Kurds in terms of what they want. And we have a kind of split consciousness, and it reflects different experiences, at least different political kind of cultural locations within Turkish political domain. And equally important point in your presentation, I thought, is your ability to reveal the multi-layered narrative among the Kurds. Now, this is very important because frequently, as you said, in literature, we see arguments that rely on one narrative as the kind of universal narrative among the Kurds, whether it's autonomy or independence, and people can be confused about it. Still, New York Times will talk about PKK as a separatist organization, while PKK is certainly a violent organization. They're not separatists. I mean, that doesn't make them better organization for in terms of what they do, but in terms of their discourse, it doesn't really fit to the claimed position. Now, one question that I want to raise is, given that we have different narratives among the Kurds, reflecting their experiences, aspirations, and challenges as individuals and as collectivities, should we not treat them all as authentic positions as authentic narratives. And that's something I think we academics should take into consideration. We should ask ourselves, should, for example, progressive politics of Kurds, when it is dismissive of the kind of nationalist Kurds, for example, should academics also be dismissive of them, or vice versa? There are Kurds for whom ethnicity is not important, for example, or not as important as other issues like comfort of life, decent, position in society, and so on. All those different attitudes should be embraced, at least understood in their authenticity. I think that would be, lesson I draw from your discussion, and I thought I will highlight it. And if you have any comments on that, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the positive feedback. I'm glad that this makes sense. Certainly the complexity, I think it's very important that it needs to be appreciated. And I struggled with this for quite some time, going back and forth, like using French as sounding boards, like, I didn't think about, even though I've done this, I think in some ways, but I didn't think about this, the appreciation of the multi-layered narratives, different people wanting different things, like, as you said, the progressives versus the nationalists, and like, some saying, if you want an independent state. I mean, there is also this kind of, I think, impression you're a better Kurd than if you don't want that, right? So I think understanding people's positions and where they are coming from, even if they don't want to be anything, they just want rights. I think that recognition, I think that's a brilliant point. I think maybe while I'm going to revise this essay, I'm going to think about how to maybe incorporate, because I agree with you, not just because you said, but this I think is an important element.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now let's hear any questions, comments from the audience. In the remaining 15 minutes or so, we can.
Moms, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Aslam. I wonder, what is your hypothesis in that research? What's your null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis? Yeah.
What is my hypothesis? That's a good question.
It means thesis, probably.
Yeah. What do you like? So at the end of the research, you say Kurdish people want to have a free state, or like Kurdish people, they don't want to have a free state, Like, what is the main conclusion, What is your hypothesis here?
So I guess what my thesis is that the research so far, of course, with exceptions on the Kurdish struggle in Turkey, is that the Kurds, and I've heard this from many people, and I've read this, my review of the literature, is that the Kurds now want three things: constitutional recognition of their identity, language rights, cultural rights, education in mother language within the existing Turkish state borders. So that's, democratic transition in Turkey. Kurds want to be part of Turkey. They want these rights. And if they get these rights, things are fine. My thesis, even though it's a complicated one, as I showed, like the multi-layered sort of narratives in the two places, is that may be true, when Kurds talk publicly, but there is something else behind, in closed, private, safe spaces where, the discontent and the anger comes out, and the legitimately, of course, that we, if possible, we would like to live in our own state. Now, as I said, the essay is not concerned with the feasibility or the likelihood of that statehood. I'm not sure if they will get a state. But what I'm trying to spotlight is that we cannot ignore their inner political truth, because there is this conversation that they have, that like, I was having conversation in the kitchen, in, like at homes, and people would say like, they cannot say these things that we want Kurdistan because it's criminal, right? That's what I'm trying to highlight. So I'm not, so yes, so essentially I say, I mean, if I were to like really derive some legitimate kind of simplicity from the complexity, is that the Kurds in the southeast, I think, were more conscious of like, I guess it's maybe because they have seen the conflict firsthand and they've gone through, which is not to say that, I mean, the Kurds in Istanbul have not suffered, but I think it was more prominent, in the southeast. So I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so it's not, I'm not concluding that all, everybody in Kurdistan or in Turkey, all Kurds, they want independence. It's, I think, the complexity, I think I communicated in the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Thank you, of course.
Thank you, John. Any other questions?
So I had a question regarding, the two narratives at play in the private sphere, right? As you mentioned, Aslam. So in Istanbul and towards the west, a lot of the Kurdish people, they want autonomy within the framework of the Turkish state, right? Is there still like because you just mentioned in your last answer, like really the viewpoint is, if we could have a state, we would prefer that. Is there still like a preference? If there was a possibility for a state, they would still prefer a independent state? Or is it that no, they've given completely on that thought process, they want integration and some kind of autonomy, independence for their language and their culture within the framework of a Turkish state?
Great question. I think what I understood from the conversation, and what I write in the essay, is that the Kurds, especially in the southeast, if there is a possibility, if in Pashto we say yashti madi prayashti manadi, meaning we have, okay, how to translate this? We have kept it, but we have not left it. We have kept it, we have not given up on it. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, so the essay kind of like, I think, conveys the essence of that distinction. Like, we're not talking about it actively or publicly, but we haven't given up on it either. So if the possibility comes, if the opportunity comes, we will take it. And that was the, again, not very pronounced like publicly, but in safe conversations and in private spaces, that was there. And that existed. The reason I think this struck me was that in Pakistan, because in this essay, I don't talk about the Pashtuns, but there was a time in the 1950s and 60s where Pashtun also had this double narrative. And publicly, they would say like, we want this, and that. And if you would get with them, like, let's say in a guest room, and they're like, what we want, we know, that kind of split narrative, or that kind of bifurcation, as you said, Mujahid, that has disappeared in the Pashtun discourse. Like we don't hear an independent Pashtunistan narrative in the private. It has kind of like converged on this one thing, like, we are Pakistanis, we want rights in Pakistan. But what I felt in Kurdistan, and I think it makes sense because of the level of repression that Turkey has, inflicted on the Kurds. So that, I think the desire, and that was there. Does that make sense, Neil?
It does. Now, actually, to expand on that, so in Istanbul, like in like all the Kurdish cafes and stuff, when you went to speak to Kurdish people, is there still somewhat of that hope for a possible free state, or has that been completely extinguished? And is their position now similar to Pashtos today in Pakistan, which is no, we are Turks, we just want autonomy within the state?
Yeah, thank you, Neil, for this, because I was going to ask as a follow-up to Neil's question. This is really important. In Istanbul, is that people's, maybe people really think that, that's what they want. It's not that, they are not, that they wish otherwise because they can't, so they are, demanding this. I mean, the difference contrasts with Southeastern population in this case. Yeah, if you could tell us more about that, would be really helpful.
So the question is, what do Kurds in Istanbul really think?
Yeah, when they think
Yes.
they want autonomy, but are we going to assume that in reality they want independence, and yet they say they want autonomy, or do they really want autonomy and they don't want independence?
I think that is a really good, that's a really good question. And I hope I will not disappoint you with the answer, but I think that's what I thought. I went to this one publication, which is, I think, it's based in a very predominantly Kurdish neighborhood. It's one of the two main publications.
Nubihar, is it Nubihar?
Nubihar, yeah. So
Okay.
I spoke with Suleiman.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like little Kurdistan, basically, right? So I was thinking, well, I mean, like I had these questions, do these Kurds, like what are the odds for these people to like give up on all of these things in this place and the lives that they have created and settled and, lead into an uncertain future in the Southeast, how is that possible? In what world will be that possible? So I feel like Kurds in the South, in Istanbul, I think there was also this like pressure because you have to conform to a certain, socio-political, economic, cultural dynamics, because if you want to excel, I mean, I think that's true for everyone, I would say, in the entire country, because in the Southeast also, like, really, really passionate Kurds about, literature, they're novelists, poets, and they couldn't talk about their ideas in the school while they were teaching, that was like very sad. They just needed money. That's why they were doing that. So I think that conformity of a certain degree is everywhere. But I think in places like Istanbul, I mean, I think I guess it is harder to resist conformity, because you go to school, you go to university, you meet friends, you have Turkish friends, you're more. So I feel like maybe, and I said this, maybe the assimilation was reluctant, like there was this reluctance also, but I could see that they didn't particularly like it, but they had to do it. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So because you have lives also, you have to live, you have to make a living, you have to, there is also the upward socioeconomic mobility that you have to, I think, work towards. So under I think the conditions under which you do that, I think, are probably more complicated and difficult in Istanbul than in the Southeast, where, it's, at least culturally, socially, everybody around you is a Kurd. So it's like you speak the language, you go out, so that was more, I think there was more freedom in that sense in the Southeast. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So I have another question. Now, this is actually regarding the third point of your conclusion. So you'd mentioned, like one of the third point under, I believe, future studies that could be conducted, right?
Mm-hmm.
What could cause, Kurds who've established now for generations, in the West, what could cause them to move to, the Southeast?
Mm-hmm.
So with regards to that, I mean, do you have any kind of theory or maybe hypotheses as to what could cause them to move, be it, economic factors or cultural factors, like which would weigh more heavily into potential, migration there?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I know the answer, but I think this came up in some interviews with people in the Southeast, especially this one teacher, professor actually in Artuklu University in Mardin. He said this narrative of like Kurds in the West, you know, they are settled there and they won't be able to, let's say if tomorrow there is a state, you know, they won't be able to return to their land of origin. This is also like a fabrication. This is an unimportant conversation to start with. Like, that's not, we shouldn't stop there like that. I mean, it is a question, but you know, there was like, you said, I mean, there are more important questions to to talk about, which is that the Kurds, you know, if the state is not going to guarantee them their rights and dignity in life, equality, then I think the important discussion to have is what can we do, rather than saying, well, Kurds in the West won't be able to relocate. And so I don't know if this answers the question, frankly.
No, thank you. That was actually insightful.
I mean, it is difficult. We see that in Pakistan also, you know, so Pakistan Pashtuns are in Balochistan in north.
Mhm.
Balochistan is geographically the largest province in Pakistan. And then the rest of the Pashtuns are in the north, which is Peshawar and these tribal areas, which was for a long, long, long time, this buffer zone between that the British created. But then we have Karachi, which is a province predominantly of Sindhis. It's a completely different ethnic group, but there are millions of Pashtuns in Karachi. So when we talk about these kinds of conversations, and then the question is, well, what about these Pashtuns in Karachi? Are they going to give up on, you know, and the same thing with Muslims in India, right? So Pakistan was created and there are more Muslims in India than in Pakistan, actually. And then the Bangladesh, right?
Yeah.
Also, the geographical discontiguity is, I think it is an important point to be considered.
Yeah, major contemporary issues, challenges facing modern nation states, ethnic groups in terms of how to achieve freedom in the face of geographical dispersion and so on. It's
exactly
interesting question. Yeah. Thank you. That was very helpful comparative remark. Okay, any other questions from the audience?
Mujahid, I do not have a question, but rather have some comments. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello and salam everyone again. Ibrahim is also among us, I guess. Thank you very much, Aslam, for the informative and more importantly, insightful presentation. So personally, I find it very important for researchers from outside to go and study and do research in Turkey. I feel like because they can observe the existing situation or conditions with a perspective that Kurds or Turks may not see or may not be able to look at. So that's why I highly value studies and research like yours from various perspectives. And I would like to thank you again. So I want to share something. A close friend of mine, he recently, now he's pursuing a PhD in anthropology. He went to Turkey for a field work. And he had previously did studies in research in Lebanon and Israel. He told me that he realized the situation of Kurds in Turkey is worse than that of Palestinians in Israel. And he also mentioned that there's a stronger military and state presence in the Kurdish region of Turkey, which really shocked me. So I want to share this one. And also, I looked at something else. I have noticed a tendency among many Kurdish friends to move away from identifying solely as Kurds and lean towards existing simply as humans. Strangely, I have observed a similar trend and tendency in my Russian friends who have been living in America for the past couple of years. They say things like, I am a citizen of the world, and instead of identifying as Russians. Because as being Russian has been associated, affiliated, and related with the guilt due to the conflict between the Russians and Ukrainians. So I just want to, share these thoughts with you guys. And thanks again.
Thank you, Mehmet Zeki. Very interesting points to ponder on. Yes, Aslam, any reactions to this?
No, really, I think I agree with you. Like, really, I never thought about the comparative aspect of the Kurdish situation in Turkey and the Palestinian in Israel. Although Kurds and Palestinian, they had a, some kind of like, I would say, I mean, the PKK fighters were trained in Baqa Valley, right? By, so there is that association. In fact, I don't know if this is true that some, and I'm digressing a bit here, that the black and white checkered scarf, which is very famous in Kurdistan, was imported from it's based. I think it became famous with Leila Khalid, right, the Palestinian freedom fighter, who hijacked the. So I mean, I think there is that. I guess maybe unrelated these points that I raised, but I don't know. I mean, I think I would say, to quote Ismail Besikci, is that probably in some ways the Kurdish situation in Turkey is worse than a lot of situations of people in other parts of the world. He says that it is not even a colony. It is less than a colony, right? So, and in colonial, the British, for example, colonized India, but they at least recognized Indians as Indians, their identity. So Israelis, even if they repress Palestinians, at least they don't reduce them to nothing. They still acknowledge that these are Palestinians and Arabs. So I think in that sense, the situation of Kurds is far more worse than I think a lot of people oppressed nations. Professor Mujahid, you have that article on how Islam is instrumentalized. It's fascinating, right? Like, in every which way the Kurds, the state has, like, just to reduce Kurds to nothing. His brothers and like all these different things, but Kurds.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The question is about recognition in terms of, recognition. Kurds score worse than Palestinians or colonized people, as you said, because, Kurds can be anything but Kurds. Ethnicity is not desire. So, there isn't desire to destroy Kurds per se in Turkey. That would be exaggeration to talk about the desire on the part of the Turkish state to destroy Kurds, but there is desire to eliminate Kurdishness as an identity, as an ethnicity. You can see this as part of an nation state project that's lingering around from the authoritarian moment in the 20th century. But in terms of comparisons, lack of recognition is in some ways more hurtful than some other forms of oppression. But in terms of privileges of assimilation, then Kurds have opportunities that other groups don't have. Like, you can become a Turk and have a happy life ever after in Turkey as a Kurd. No one is going to stop you from becoming Turkish. So that is an outlet from the oppressed condition, not a desirable one, but sometimes it's the only option for some people. And I personally think that we should respect people for whatever reason who opt for such options. If it reflects their will, then it deserves our respect. If it is despite their will, then it is it's assimilation, it's coercion, and so there's an important distinction there to be kept. For that matter, by force, if you are liberating people despite their will, then that is also unacceptable, cannot be respected. So you are an armed group, you want to liberate your people despite your people's will. That is, in my view, kind of oppressive politics, let alone violence, in terms of approach. So, but certainly such comparisons allow us to understand the specificity of each case. And Kurdish case, I tend to think is really cannot be exactly captured by a post-colonial approach. This is something I have to expand on it and talk about it, but just for now, I'll stop here. But yeah, great question, great response. Thank you.
And one just quick thing. I hope.
Please go ahead.
How much time do we have? Do we have time?
Yeah, we do certainly. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I really like your distinction between this, Kurds as when it comes to the recognition of their identity. I think the score goes very, very low compared to Palestinians and many other groups. But when it comes to if you're willing to navigate, this, even if reluctantly, become part of the mainstream politics, and then I think you're much better off in Turkey as a Kurd than if you are a Palestinian and you live in Tel Aviv. I mean, it's a very different world there, of course. And with regards to yes, identity, what was interesting there is a conversation that I had with a young man from Shirnak in 2015. There was a war between the state and PKK fighters. And so this friend was in Istanbul going to college when the war happened, and then he went back. And so he shared pictures with me before the war and after the war and how everything looked. So there is, during the war, the state actually erased pretty much the whole town, little city to the ground and rebuilt these, like tower blocks, So he said when he went back, it was like everything he knew was not there, right? The streets that he would walk on to go to the store were not there. The places where he played with his childhood friends were not there. His aunts and uncles where they lived, their homes were not there. So it was, in a sense, an erasure of not just a place, a physical place, but of identity and memory, right? I mean, now I don't know. He said it's the state has done this, through this politics of architecture, right? That it's actually like the erasure of a peoplehood, a sense of peoplehood, and which was very interesting. It made sense, like how pretty much everything had changed for him. Like the things that he related to, the bonds that people had, those things had changed. And there is actually a term, toponomical engineering, right? So in Turkey, this engineering the state has kind of conducted was not just the change in the names of places, but also these kinds of, for example, scenarios where like an entire place is destroyed and rebuilt, and that as a result, what people go through, like, so I just wanted to raise that in, to your point about the lack of, or, the absence of recognition of the Kurds.
All right. Thank you, Aslam. If there are no other questions, I think we can, it's about time to conclude. I want to thank you once again for your generous intellectual presentation that stirred a lot of interesting ideas for us all, and hopefully for you as well. And I want to thank our friends in the audience for their questions and contributions. And inshallah, we'll see you in future events. As you know, on May 24th, we have an on-campus event in Chicago. It's our annual lecture. Professor Müge Göçek, one of the co-authors of the book Kurds in Dark Times, co-editor, she will be speaking. So well, hopefully I will see some of you there. For the others, looking forward to see you again in our future talks on Zoom. All right, thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. You too. Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thank you.